So it gives me great pleasure to welcome former diplomat, author, parliamentarian, and someone who we still proudly call a Mumbaiker, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Mumbai was all ears as parliamentarian and author Shashi Tharoor used his long career at the United Nations and his expertise as chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on External Affairs to explain how the current world order had evolved.
I'm afraid a world convulsed by war, challenged by increasing fragmentation, and confronted by the erosion of the shared principles that had sustained the world order. So the certainties of yesterday are giving way to uncertainties today.
Talking about COVID accelerating geopolitical changes, he made India's case for pragmatic national interest and multi-alignment.
So let's hope that things go in the way that we are capable of making them go. Thank you for listening to me so patiently, and Jai Hind.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here to do this conversation with Dr. Tharoor. He's not only, as you know, one of our most erudite and articulate political leaders.
Thank you.
And authors, but he's also, and especially in the past few months, you've become the face of Indian diplomacy. You know, almost, if I were to put it, like India's ambassador to the world.
You're far too generous and far too kind, but I'm happy to accept.
You know what I mean, right?
I get enough hate mail most of the time, so it's nice to have some love coming my way. Many thanks.
Let's talk about multilateralism because you ended with that note. And we've seen how the rules-based order has eroded. You've spent, like you said, 30 years at the UN, worked with...
29 actually, but nonetheless.
Worked with Kofi Annan, up to 2006 when you lost out on that Secretary General election to Ban Ki-moon. The question I have to you is how in this world that you've described so lucidly in the past half an hour, how do you make a case for multilateralism? Because what has happened is that all those greater good of humanity, whether it's climate change, global south, health, the SDGs, all of those have gone out of the window, it feels. How do you make
They haven't gone out the windows because what we do to replace them? I mean, the problem is these are real problems.
Yeah.
I mean, the environment does affect everybody, right? So these problems without passports, to use Kofi's phrase again, require blueprints without borders. You have to be able to transcend national divisions to be able to find solutions. Otherwise, it doesn't work. No country can solve the environment on its own, right? So if you can't promote cooperation, it doesn't work. Even the agenda-setting function of the UN, in just actually agreeing on the main principles, the main diagnosis of some of these problems can be invaluable. Now, I'm not suggesting that they've done a superb job. I mean, now, I think India is going to be hosting COP33 or is it COP38 in a few years' time. But by then, God knows how much has changed in the climate that we haven't been able to arrest. Global warming has already exceeded the dire projections and predictions of
so how do you make a case for a strong UN, given the Security Council and how it works, and given that we are seeing all these conflicts break out? How do you make a case for something you believe in so strongly?
The best answer to your question was actually given by a former Soviet ambassador to the UN many, many decades ago, a man called Yakov Malik, who said famously, whenever people ask me, what's the use of the UN? So, what good does it do? Whatever. He says, I'm reminded of a story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where Adam finds that Eve is becoming a bit indifferent to him. So Adam says to Eve, Eve, is there someone else? And that's the real question about the UN. Is there anything else? Is there any alternative? I mean, this is what we've got. And honestly, I doubt we'd be able to create it today if it didn't exist. We've got to try and make it work. There is no alternative to it. And honestly, that's what it comes down to. Is there anything else? There isn't. Is there any other common platform where all the countries of the world can come together and actually deal with the kinds of issues we've been talking about? There isn't. And that's the case. It may not be the best enough case. But then again, to give you an old quote, Dag Hammarskjöld famously said that the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save humanity from hell. Sometimes the best it can do is not the best that you want it to do, but to prevent things from getting any worse.
But
at least that it can do.
In terms of conflicts, it hasn't managed to do that, isn't it?
In some conflicts it has. You see, whenever the superpowers don't have a stake, then conflicts can be resolved. There are conflicts resolved in many parts of Africa, conflicts resolved in many corners of the world, the Middle East, even at one time. For example, the war in Lebanon was brought to an end with UN peacekeepers being deployed. You also had the earlier iterations. I mean, Middle East has seen so many different conflicts now, West Asia, but nonetheless, many were indeed resolved by the UN. Then you've seen, the UN bringing solutions to everything from Haiti to Georgia, lots of places where it was in the interest of the big powers to let the smaller and middle powers under the UN's blue flag come in and police the peace. And this is why the UN won. The UN Blue Helmets have won the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, twice. So I would say that things have worked. But when the big powers, whether it was the Soviet Union and the US in those days, who fortunately didn't get into a hot war, or today it so happens that the two involved are the US and Russia, then I'm afraid if they are directly engaged in basically tossing the charter aside and marching in pursuit of their interests, then there's nothing much that the rest of the world can do except try and temper it, try and contain it, try and alleviate the consequences for the people on the ground, and hope like heck that they would stop sooner rather than later. Now, both these conflicts, Ukraine and Gaza, are showing no signs of stopping. But that's the worry that if they don't, that we all have, it seems to me, an enormous sort of frustration, thank you so much, frustration about whether the world order is working for the rest of the world. I mean, the horror stories coming out of Gaza day after day makes people feel despair for humanity. And at one time that was also true of what was coming out of Ukraine. And yet it goes on.
And we're watching all of this streamed real time. But Dr. Tharoor, let me ask you about, you brought up Gaza and Russia. Let's talk about, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's look at how India's relations, and you talked about national interest, we've talked about this in the past, India's national interest in both these contexts. So, for instance, Russian oil has gone up to about 40% of our, contributing to about
36 to be exact, but yes,
close to 40% of our oil imports from about 2%. And we've got India abstain several times now on any resolutions that the General Assembly has tried to bring on Gaza because of its relationship, because of our relationship now strategically with Israel.
That's right.
And I've spoken to former ambassadors who say that, the last resolution, even allies of Israel have actually voted against Israel on that one. So help us evaluate what you make of India's national interest.
We find it out. So the last vote of the General Assembly, India voted for a ceasefire. And there are very few countries now left supporting Israel's continuing this war, and India is no longer amongst them. So that's good. But earlier, you're right. It was strategic calculations. I'm guessing, because no one explained it to me, but I think the feeling was that India felt that that Israel is too indispensable a partner in a number of areas, particularly relating to defense and security issues, and that they felt, therefore, that they have to show Israel the appreciation that an abstention would give them, as opposed to asking them to abandon what they judge to be their strategic interest in continuing the conflict. But now India, like in common with the rest of the world, says enough is enough. This has to stop. And they have now gone ahead and voted in the General Assembly.
And so many countries have now said that they will recognize Palestine. India has already done that. But do you...
We were the first country outside the region to recognize Palestine.
Is there a diminishing of India's moral authority, moral position, given that we understand pragmatism and national interest is what drives nations on this front?
Well, there is certainly a change between the sort of moralistic India of the Nehruvian era and the more pragmatic India since then. But did that change only happen now? I mean, one could argue that Indira Gandhi signing the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation in 1971 was a very pragmatic act, especially since it involved an adversary in the Cold War at that time, and then proceeding later to ignore it when it had served its purpose in the 71 war with Pakistan. Those are very pragmatic and very sort of almost realpolitik kind of actions.
Yeah.
So it's not that India has been always moralistic or moral even in its foreign policy actions and choices. we will always put national interest first, but every country does that, Anuradha. Even those countries that profess to have a moral foreign policy will use morality as a fig leaf to justify their naked ambitions. And you've seen this, frankly, with, for example, the Brits and their moral foreign policy when they joined the Americans in invading Iraq. Or the Americans in some of their interventions in Latin America, again under the guise of morality. So I think in all fairness, one has to accept that whenever anyone says moral foreign policy, I think you quickly make sure your wallet's still in place. Because there is a certain level of insincerity involved in all of this vocabulary. Everyone is looking after their national interests. But I think we have now realized that there are some aspects of our national interests that are better served by taking a stand on principle. So rather than use the word moral, I would use the word principle. And there is no doubt that the suffering of the people of Gaza has simply crossed all acceptable limits to the human conscience. And that's why I think India voted the way it did last week.
Let's talk about India and Iran.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a matter of principle, but India distanced itself from the SCO statement, which was a lot more harsher on Israel than India's own statements, which were a little more anodyne. War is not good, de-escalate, etc. Question is, it's not just principle there, it's also self-interest and national interest, isn't it? Because Iran is quite pivotal to India's access to that part, that region in the world, isn't it? So how would you evaluate how India's handled that?
I think we're watching Iran as a very complicated relationship because if Iran suddenly moves into a center of gravity dominated by China and involving Pakistan, that would certainly hurt us. But conversely, for example, during the time of the earlier Taliban regime, Iran was actually working and cooperating with us against the Pakistani-supported Taliban regime of the late 90s. And that's a good example where having kept our options open with Iran at a time when the West was demonizing it actually served our purposes. I think it's now an open secret that Iran and India were cooperating in some of the resistance to the Taliban government in the late 90s and the very beginning of the century. So I think we need to have some connections there. At the same time, we do have long sort of civilizational links. We have, of course,
commercial
the Parsi community is from Iran. There's also the Irani community, which are not Parsis, who are also here. And there's been a lot of back and forth over a few hundred, if not a few thousand years. So we can't just completely write off all of that because these connections actually do matter. Given all of that, I think India is trying to keep its channels of communication open in all of these divides. But certainly on the Iran-America conflict, we hoped like hell it would finish quickly, and mercifully it did. And we breathed a sigh of relief because we didn't want to be forced to either support more American bombing, and for that matter, Israeli bombing. Nor did we want to support the condemnation by the other countries of what was being done to Iran. So we were in a very awkward position. Our usual excuse is that we only dissociate ourselves from statements that don't condemn the terrorism against us. And the SCO didn't mention terrorism. Indeed, even some of our abstentions of the UN were because the statements that seemed to demand that Israel give a ceasefire didn't also condemn terrorism in the same breath. So we've got this kind of crusade against terrorism in our own interest as well in all these international platforms.
So you don't think that India has lost any sheen as a nation that believes in principles, if not morality, if we take that out of the context of nations, in these two cases?
We have interests everywhere. Those interests require a certain amount of dexterity in their public articulation as well as in their private evolution. So it means essentially that when we're talking to the Americans about what's going on in Iran, we may not be saying exactly the same thing as we say when we talk to the Iranians about what's going on with America. But that is not duplicity, that is normal international diplomacy. Throughout in our minds, what we are concerned about is how do we make sure that our interests are preserved and how do we make sure we don't create enemies where we don't need them?
You talked about how we had a unipolar world for almost a decade and more. You talked about how it's evolved to a bipolar world, and now India wants it to be a multipolar world, or at least is managing foreign policy with that outlook. How much has Donald Trump changed the world further, this new world order? How much has he contributed to it with his unpredictability?
That's precisely his contribution.
And with our most immediate concern, which is the tariffs that he's imposed, 25%.
Yeah, I mean, well, the tariffs, fortunately, we can still negotiate downwards, I hope. At least there is a trade negotiation going on. The idea is that nothing is sealed forever.
Yeah.
But certainly this was a rude shock, a rude shock for us. And I must say that that it's not the only unsettling thing he said and done. He said things about
the penalty for Russian oil.
That's unsettling for us.
Yeah.
But he's also said, for example, to the Europeans, he had Vance go out and basically say, Ukraine will have to settle the war on Russia's terms, more or less, is what the Americans said. Now he seems to have backed off from that and is again turning hostile to Russia because Russia wouldn't listen to him and sue for peace. But the fact is that there's all this volatility coming out of his pronouncements, often on social media rather than in any sort of normal diplomatic communication. It's all caps on Truth Social. I mean, what do you do?
Yeah. So, Dr. Tharoor, how does India manage him? Because, there is a dissonance.
Can anyone manage him?
But we have to, right? No one can manage him, but we'll have to. And
we have to manage our own reactions to him.
And also perhaps the perceptions of the relationship, because we believe, I mean, when you look at the images that we see of Prime Minister Modi with President Trump, and we see all the hyperbolistic description of that relationship of India and America, and then none of the actions that President Trump has made in the last few weeks, and even after Operation Sindoor, so economical both with the truth and facts. How do we interpret what in the Indo-US relationship is at this point? Because as a layperson, I thought he was our best friend and we had it in our bag and he just listened to everything we said. And now he says we're a dead economy. He says, good luck to you and Russia. He wants, between his own personal business interests in Pakistan and Pakistan's relevance to America, which is never going to go down. What happened?
We're going to find out. I mean, the truth is, I wish I was as omniscient as these questions imply. No, the truth is, it's really a reflection of a mercurial individual issuing statements that may or may not reflect an underlying shift in national strategy and policy. I say may or may not, because the American system is very different from that of most other countries. The individual in the White House has a tremendous latitude to say and do what he likes, but there is a vast system beneath him that works often to the march of a different drummer.
But Elon Musk has fired that entire system, isn't it? That system doesn't exist.
No, but there still is. I mean, for example, I had a meeting with the entire State Department establishment that existed. I can't say the entire because many positions had not yet been confirmed. That's the other thing about the American system. The Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, who's going to be our principal interlocutor, is somebody of half Indian origin, a man called S. Paul Kapoor. But he hadn't been confirmed then. He hadn't even had his hearings yet. So he couldn't be at the meetings and we couldn't actually include him in the conversation. But the Deputy Secretary of State, all the senior officials assisting him on South Asia, the people dealing with many of the issues we care about were at the table, and they were totally understanding, supportive, and fully sympathetic to every point we made. I mean, literally to the extent that we could have said that we would not have had a better outcome than if we had written their talking points for them. So when you look at that, you feel reassured that the system works. Then you've got the senators and congressmen. I met a whole bunch of them.
You also met Vice President Vance.
I met Vice President Vance. Totally in the same track. Very, very much understanding, turned right around and repeated with respect for India his understanding and sympathy for our stands on many things. So the fact that the one man who doesn't perhaps fully understand or value or empathize with us happens to be in the most important position assumes an outsized importance in our minds. But there is a larger foreign policy bureaucracy that's moving in ways that we would like, and we still have to work with them, and we can probably temper the practical consequences of all this rhetoric in the actual evolution of policy. Now, if it turns out that policy itself is shifting, that there is now a real directive to this entire bureaucracy to turn around and do something different. We are yet to find that out, and I think I don't expect that to be the case. But if it is so, we will find out. I mean, the point is, this is an unpredictable environment. It is unusually unpredictable. Trump 1.0 was not so unpredictable, not least because Trump 1.0 seemed to follow the classic template that the US saw its biggest threat as being from the emerging hegemon China, that therefore India was a useful potential counterweight and bulwark. So we have to support India because it's good for us in America. Therefore, let's support India. And therefore, all the optics, the Ab Ki Baar, Modi Sarkar and all that stuff was very much sort of window dressing or icing on a cake which had been baked in the context of a US-Chinese rivalry. Today, we're no longer so sure because Mr. Trump is making warm noises about Xi Jinping, talking about wanting to meet him, talking about a possible tariff deal with China. Now, if all that happens, we may well find ourselves left high and dry, and then there may be a genuine strategic policy set of choices.
So was it a misstep? Have we overestimated the relationship?
I wouldn't say necessarily, because we don't really know how the very efficient and realistic foreign policy bureaucracy on our side, whether they actually swallowed all the PR that the media was regurgitating. Again, we too have a system where the political class and their publicity machinery will say and behave in a certain way, which is not necessarily reflective of the underlying realities. I mean, as you know, our media in particular, the sort of hysterical right-wing mass media, had us capturing Islamabad, overthrowing Sharif and General Munir, bombarding Karachi, God knows what else was supposed to have happened. The truth is that if we are misled by that into thinking that our foreign policy bureaucracy, our Ministry of External Affairs, our ambassadors are all swallowing the same hype, we'd be fooling ourselves. They know what the reality is.
That's good to hear.
Relationships. And I think that's honestly the way in which we will have to go, because to us, there is no real doubt about the fact that India has faced and will continue to face some serious challenges, which will require cooperation from the US. We cannot write them off. And at the same time, we also have to depend to some degree on viable trade relations with China. Talk to our business community, which does not want us to turn hostile to China when it comes to importing machinery. The things we make in this country often require Chinese machines to make them with.
And for the past 6-7 months, we seem to be resetting that relationship, isn't it? After 2020 and Galwan, we are seeing visas being issued, Kailash Mansarovar being accessed again to India.
Well, we began a thaw in September, Anuradha, when there was a conscious effort made to try and improve relations with China. But that took a bit of a setback during Sindoor, when the Chinese were so blatantly helping the Pakistanis, including through real-time satellite intelligence on the presence of our planes and troops and missiles and so on. So honestly, it's not quite the same as September, but Mansarovar is a reflection of what had been agreed before Sindoor had happened.
Okay, so it's not as if that relationship is going full steam ahead. It's still going to be tempered as
well. I think we're talking.
Our expectations.
We're talking, and we can't afford not to talk to them either.
Dr. Tharoor, I'm being cued to open this up and not hog the conversation. So let me get some questions in. Okay, I can see a hand there. There's a lady in the third row from the back.
Hello, sir. So good to hear your talk, and it was a delight to be present here. My questions to you would be, what do you think of India's chances for a permanent seat in UN Security Council? And when would we see an Indian being the Secretary General for United Nations?
Well, look, as far as the Security Council seat is concerned, everyone feels it would be a very good idea, but we can't get it alone. Other countries will also have to benefit. And there's a huge problem in getting consensus behind a formula. For example, you can't get the 2/3 of the General Assembly required without the 54 African votes, where the Africans insist on 2 permanent seats for them, and so far others haven't agreed to that. Here's one example. There's also a lot of resistance to some of the contenders. The Pakistanis and to some degree the Chinese are not at all keen on India. The Argentinians are not keen on Brazil. The Europeans are not keen on Germany. I mean, you've got all of these issues. The Chinese are not keen on Japan either. So it's not going to happen overnight, because I remember when Boutros Ghali, Secretary General, in 1992 said that he hoped that UN reform of the Security Council would be done and dusted in time for the golden jubilee of the organization. When was that? 1995. Well, the 50th anniversary is gone, the 60th is gone, the 70th is gone, now the 80th is this year. I'm afraid there isn't any likely immediate prospect. And so my own view is that let's focus on other things at the moment. Let's not give up our claims, because those are legitimate claims. But at the moment, there are bigger fish to fry. As far as the Security Council's Secretary General position is concerned, it's expected to be Latin America's turn now. There's an informal understanding that every 10 years, the position will rotate amongst continents. So we had a European in Kurt Waldheim, succeeded by a Latin American in Perez de Cuellar, succeeded by, as it happens, 2 Africans, Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan, succeeded by an Asian, which is when I ran for it.
And Ban
Ki-moon, succeeded again by a European. Guterres, he will be succeeded by a Latin. The Latin will be succeeded by an African, and 10 years later, it'll be Asia's turn again. By which time, certainly, I won't be around to take much of an interest in that race. So that train has left the station as far as India is concerned. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Dr. Tharoor, I thank you so much. It's such a privilege to hear you. I'm wondering, when we talk about India's position in the New World Order, I sometimes sort of sense a little bit of hubris in those statements. And, we're the 5th largest country as far as GDP is concerned. 4th largest country as far as GDP. But we're also the 141st, we're 141 when it comes to per capita income.
That's right.
I was reading up somewhere.
The Human Development Index isn't great either.
Right. Global Gender Gap Index, we're 131 out of 148, 79 out of 142 in the Rule of Law Index, 24 out of 33 countries when it comes to the Free Speech Index. And
you're slipping on the Press Freedom Index too, while you're going on through that list.
So my point is that, is there, do you think India's position in this world order would improve if were we to spend a little more time in fixing some of these institutional voids that exist in the country? And is there a way for us to focus on a more inclusive sort of way forward as a country?
Well, the topic was the world order. And in the world order, I'm afraid it's the absolute size, the absolute heft, the absolute capacity that does count. But as Indians ourselves, I know we would much rather be doing better on all those indices than caring about how we do in the rest of the world. We are now in a much more interdependent world, though. And therefore, it is important in this globalized environment that we also displace weight in a useful way, but with a view to enhancing our own development and growth and our improvement in all these indices. I agree with you. I don't like being in any of those positions on any of those indices. I'd like them all to improve. And it's partially our job in this country to try and make them improve. Improve our role in everything from human development to gender empowerment to rule of law to press freedom, all of those things where we've been slipping. And that's what our democracy gives us the right to do, and we should be all out there doing it. But at the same time, when you're talking about India's place in the world order, we are the most populous country in the world. We are the 3rd largest economy. We are one of the most powerful militaries. We do have some extremely advanced technology in a number of areas. So we displace some weight, right? Even when you sit around with the rest of South Asia, you could say at one point last year, it was true, it no longer is, I think, where at one point Bangladesh had a better per capita income than we did. But when we sit at a table with the rest of South Asian countries, we displace more weight than the rest of them put together. We account for 70% of the population of South Asia and 80% of the GDP. Of course, the rest of them are conscious of us. So that's what I meant. It's not in any way diminishing the points you make. It is to say that, while that's our internal concern, from the rest of the world, it's the macro picture they see, and that's a very big picture and a formidable picture.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.